All right, good morning officially, everyone. I'm Kristine Rivers, and I am currently the Advanced Training Director. I was an intern just like you in 2016, and I jumped in with both feet. I was president 2017 through 2019, and I've been in various roles since then. But now I'm in advanced training, which is kind of my passion, is sharing knowledge with people. But I encourage y'all to dip your toe in everything, try stuff out, even if it's not a current interest. Like I did Sea Turtle Patrol for a while. There's all kinds of great activities, and just soak up what you can. This is going to be amazing. I grew up in Manville, which is just south of Pearland here in Brazoria County, and we moved there in 1972, and I was incredibly interested
Good morning.
in birds.
Sign in, Donna.
And my mom knew everything, it seemed like, about wildflowers and native plants, but nothing about birds. And so she would always tell me, look it up. And so she got me field guides, she got me binoculars, and I would sit out in the yard drawing birds, and I would try to learn everything about them. By the time I was 14, I did my first Christmas bird count with the National Audubon Society. I read about it in the Houston Chronicle, and I called them, and I didn't know if they'd let me participate because I was so young. And of course, they welcomed me in. And that was back when your parents would drop you off at 6 a.m. with complete strangers to go play in the woods. And over the years, my entire family got drug in. I went to the University of Oklahoma as a professional zoology major because I wanted to be an ornithologist. I discovered a couple of years in, I don't have the right temperament to be a scientist. My college professor for ornithology studied sibling rivalry in egrets in Oklahoma, and he'd been doing it for years. And there was never enough resources. They would lay two eggs, one chick would always overpower the other, and it would die. And I could not imagine myself just out in the field going, yep, there went another one, and you're not allowed to sneak fish to things when you're a scientist. So I stepped back. I went back as an art major, and of course, ended up doing all kinds of other stuff. But in 2015, I founded my company, Birding for Fun. And that's kind of how I was teaching birding for City of Pearland. And my boss there was a Texas master naturalist. That's how I found out about it. And I realized I'm a naturalist. I'm not a scientist, I'm a naturalist. And so I have spent a lot of time uh, immersing myself in birds. I do a lot of virtual workshops and in-person classes now. I do bird walks, I do all kinds of stuff, and I do family events. I have a contract with the city of League City to do nature events for families that are free. So I do all kinds of stuff, and I'm also an author. If you want to know about that, I'll tell y'all that later. So how many of y'all are birders? How many of y'all are semi-interested in birds and maybe you do some bird watching? Yes. Those of you who didn't raise your hands, I'm hoping to really draw you in today. Let me turn this.
And you can't be shy with her.
Yeah. Okay. So the unit goals, as stated by the book, are today we want to understand causes for bird diversity. We want to understand the habits of bird migration and identify the flyways that go through our area. We're going to talk about bird behavioral characteristics in relation to the environment, so how they interact with their habitat. We want you to be aware of and be able to talk about conservation concerns for birds. Am I out of it? Oh, yeah, I'm darkening. And identify how birds function within an overall ecosystem, and understand how bird populations are monitored. So why do we study the natural histories of birds? Natural histories include looking at how birds live, how they interact with the habitat, what they eat, their nesting habits, where they migrate to and from. And that gives us a better understanding of each species. And by knowing their migrating patterns and their nesting habits and things like that, we can start understanding, in a lot of cases, human impact and how that's impacting mortality of birds, and we can try to intervene when needed. Once it's recognized that a population of birds is declining to a really serious extent where if things continue on, they'll go extinct, federally they're put on the endangered species list. And there's also a threatened status, which means they're likely to become endangered. So both of these statuses for birds or other animals usually result in those populations being monitored and adjustments being made to help them survive. We've got several different birds that fall in those categories, and we're going to talk about each one of these. The golden-cheeked warbler, which is in this picture here, a black-capped vireo, which was endangered, but now is considered vulnerable, whooping cranes, Atwater's prairie chicken and lesser prairie chicken, and red puck-headed woodpecker. And you'll notice this lesser prairie chicken was delisted from threatened in 2016. And that happened as a result of the change in administration federally. They took them off the list and now you can hunt them.
Is that also well, maybe not the lesser, but the other prairie chicken? Houston Zoo has a
Atwater's prairie chicken.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So golden-cheeked warblers are the only warbler that is endemic to Texas. That means they only breed and nest in Texas. They nowhere else. They have a very specific habitat requirement of mature growth junipers. So they have to be old growth, and those are being cut down, right? So now the areas where they breed are protected and maintained, so the habitat is maintained. The black-capped vireo lives in the same area. This is a hill country bird, and the black-capped vireo is as well. And it breeds throughout Oklahoma and Texas, and it has been helped by maintaining the habitat, which it requires secondary growth. So that happens like if there's a fire from a lightning and it wipes everything out and it grows, secondary growth. So they started doing prescribed burns to try to maintain that habitat. They like scrub oak and juniper. And they also were having a lot of trouble with brown-headed cowbirds parasitizing their nests. And so they started controlling the populations of brown-headed cowbirds in the area where they breed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did that so they just got delisted, right? The black-capped vireo, you said?
Yes.
Did that all the fires in Bastrop help them to do better?
Possibly,
or...
yeah, because that would be secondary growth.
Yeah.
The scrub areas. Whooping cranes, y'all are probably all familiar with, and the population of whooping cranes that is there now is all from our Texas population. It declined to around 20 in the world back in, gosh, I should have looked that up, a long time ago. And so they used to be hunted, and they've had habitat problems. And so they started monitoring them. They founded the Aransas Pass National Wildlife Refuge to protect their wintering grounds. And then there's a park in Canada that they protect the breeding grounds. And they are the only natural population that migrates between those two areas. They established some populations in Louisiana and Florida. The Louisiana population does not migrate at all. The Florida population, they taught to migrate using ultralight gliders to teach them how to go. But all of them came from our Texas population. And now there's maybe 600 individuals in the wild, so still not very many. And then another couple of hundred that are in captivity. We are going to talk about this red cockaded woodpecker here in a little bit. We'll come back to him. So you saw two different kinds of prairie chickens on that list. Our Atwater's prairie chicken it's a subspecies of the greater prairie chicken. It requires tall grass prairies with areas in between, bare ground areas. It's very difficult to find that habitat. Their habitat has been greatly impacted by all of these wind farms that have been put in, all of the the encroachment of urban areas. And so there are very few, and most of them are captive bred now. The lesser prairie chicken was the one that was completely delisted in 2016. It requires short grass prairies, so a different habitat than the other one. And again, it's been impacted by humans. And now, even though it is threatened conservation-wise, you can hunt these because they took them off the list. So understanding the natural histories of those birds led to changes in land management practices, and that helped their chances of survival. And so we continue to study them over time. We're always learning things. DNA has taught us a lot about birds. We do have a lot of encroachment in urban areas. They're putting in these housing developments right and left. And some birds, like a white-winged dove, do really well with living around humans. And so their population has exploded. Do any of y'all have white-winged doves at your feeders? They're bullies. They push out other bird species. So their increase has impacted other bird species negatively. Come on in. So we do try to understand how the distribution affects the ecosystem. Once they are pushing in, they're pushing out other species. So birds are amazingly diverse. There are over 10,000 species of birds worldwide, and they are separated into 41 taxonomic orders or groups of species that have related lineage. And they are incredibly successful at surviving. You can think of birds in the Arctic, in the desert, in heavily forested areas, in beach areas, in wetlands, right? They can make a life in a lot of places. And that's because they have such a huge diversity of physical features. You can see different bill shapes, like ibis has that long down curved bill, insect eaters have a little tiny bill. Different ways of moving around in the world, like penguins swim, right? They don't fly. Different things that they eat and different behaviors, which we're going to look at in depth. And that gives them a lot of ecological opportunities. They eat a lot of different things. Some birds are plant eaters or herbivores. And even within that, some of them focus on just fruit and seeds. Some of them eat the flowers and the pollen and the nectar, like hummingbirds. Some of them eat fibrous materials and plants and stems. And then we have insectivorous birds, which is not just insects, but also small invertebrates. And then piscivorous, and they are eating things like fish and frogs and larger aquatic invertebrates like crawdads, right? Crawfish, sorry. Carnivorous birds eat warm-blooded prey. And then there's some that are scavengers. If you think about gulls, right? They'll eat anything they can find. And then some of them are omnivorous and may shift in different seasons to eating different types of food. According to the American Birding Association, there have been 993 species documented in North America. And of those, 660 have been documented here in Texas. 2/3 of the species of birds in North America have been documented right here in Texas. And that's because, one, it's huge. There's a huge variety of habitats here. And because we're in a temperate zone, right? So we get birds that come here. We have birds that are here year round. If you think about like blue jays and cardinals, right? We have birds that just pass through briefly during migration on their way to somewhere else. And we have birds that come here for breeding season and leave us in the winter. And then right now we have a ton of species that are overwintering. So winter is my favorite time because all the raptors come in and tons of different shorebirds and sparrows and so many things that you can't see any other time of year. So I want y'all to think about how habitat changes impact species diversity and survival. And I want to use my mom's property as an example. In Manville, it's a 1 acre property. And in 1972, when we moved there, it had been converted from pasture land. There were active farms all around us with agricultural crops and animal husbandry. People were raising cattle and pigs and horses. And the yard itself was mostly open. There were some ornamental trees that had been planted. There was a lot of pear trees, mulberry trees, pecan, mimosa, sycamore, oak, tallow, crepe myrtle, wisteria, holly, and yopon. And then 50 years later, it's really changed around that property and within the property. So most of the surrounding farms are no longer active. And the nearby land has been overgrown or worse, overtaken by development. A lot of the people that grew up at the same time as me, when their parents pass and they come into that land, they can make a bunch of money selling it to a housing development. But now on the property itself, it's all mature trees, but it's limited to mostly oak and tallow because the others didn't survive the local hurricanes. And my mom is still really into native plants and wildflowers. And so she has a ton of pollinator beds all over the yard with native plants and herbs. So let's talk about some land birds that could be found on that property when we moved there in 1972. So a ridge-shouldered hawk is a bird that lives in the trees. It builds a nest in the trees. It eats warm-blooded prey, so it is a carnivore. And it's here year-round. And you can see them sitting on the highlines and looking straight down in the ditch. They love crawfish and snakes and things. Red-bellied woodpeckers also make their life in the trees. They scooch up the tree, they carve cavities into the tree to nest in, and they eat insects for the most part, but they also love berries. And they're very comfortable living around people. Yes?
Do woodpeckers migrate?
The only truly migratory woodpecker in our area is the yellow-bellied sapsucker, which was my spark bird. We can talk about that.
Sounds like really rude, but passive.
Northern bobwhites are a ground-dwelling bird, and they form coveys, so social groups of family groups, and they eat mostly seeds in the winter months, but in breeding season, they eat mostly insects. And that's what they feed to their young. So they need areas that have a lot of insect diversity and a lot of seeds and things. And cover to protect them. They're a game bird, right? Inca doves are pretty little doves that are a little timid. They will come to your feeder. They come to my feeder. And they only eat seeds. They are completely an herbivore. They find seeds by scratching on the ground. And they build their nest in trees. Y'all are probably familiar with Carolina wren. They are very comfortable living around people. They'll build nests in ridiculous places, like a boot on your front porch or a wreath on your front door. And they're omnivores. That bill tells you they eat insects, but they also love poison ivy berries. And they're very, very vocal. They have a lot of different calls, so you usually hear them constantly, even though they're tiny. this is our state bird, the northern mockingbird, and they are also omnivores. You'll see them on the ground tinting their wings, trying to flash their white in their feathers to scare insects up. And you see them often eating berries. This one has a little bit of purple on its face because it was gobbling up blackberries and turning its whole little face purple. Okay, so thinking about those species and the changes to the habitat over time, which ones do you think are no longer there on the property?
Bobwhite.
Anything else? The Inkadove maybe? Good job. So the northern bobwhite can't survive in the habitat now that is all overgrown and has a ton of development. I have them in my area of Manville. We're kind of in the newer converted pasture land. And then the little Inca doves have been pushed out by the white-winged doves. The encroachment of neighborhoods brought those white-winged doves in, and now her feeders are overflowing with them, and they pushed out the little Inca doves. Okay, now let's talk about some water birds. This one you may have seen. This is a black-bellied whistling duck. And when I was young, they were called tree ducks. They're perching ducks. You can see them sitting on top of people's houses, on top of the fence lines. I've seen them on high lines and even barbed wire fences. They sound like a giant squeaky toy, so I usually hear them before I see them. And they do have black bellies, but usually what you notice is this beautiful kind of pinky orange beak. And they are closer related to geese. So most ducks, male and female, look different from each other. That's not true of them. They look the same. Most ducks, the male has not got any part in raising the young, but the black-bellied whistling ducks, both parents will be with the young. So you'll see 12 little ones strung out with a parent at each end. And they have greatly increased. You used to have to go to South Texas to see this species. But we've introduced a lot of fresh water into our habitat because we have to control the flow of water because of flooding. And so now when they put in these neighborhoods and apartment complexes, they have to have retention ponds. That's fresh water. This is a freshwater species. And so they're very comfortable living around people. You see them in apartment complexes. It's a protected habitat. They can't get shot in there, right? King rails are another freshwater only species. They are ground dwelling birds. They spend a lot of time running around. You see that crazy looking bill. They love fiddler crabs and other crustaceans, and they skulk through the habitat.
How common are they around here?
Not that common. I don't see them very often. The clapper rails are everywhere, and there's hybrids that they call cling rails between king and clapper, and we see those quite a bit. But it's a little harder to see the king rails. Their rails in general are pretty elusive, and they'll dart through. Great blue herons are the largest North American heron. They're 4.5 feet tall with a 7-foot wingspan. And they, what do you think they eat with this big dagger-shaped bill?
Fish, turtles.
Whatever they want. Right, so they do eat fish and crawdads and turtles and skinks and small mammals. They eat birds, snakes, frogs, pearls, baby alligators, whatever they want. They're huge. And they are very common throughout North America because they are not just freshwater species. You see them in saltwater too. So that gives them more ecological opportunity.
How common is that color pattern? It's lighter than was predominantly.
This one,
The white. I thought they were mostly dark gray.
they are kind of a pale gray. It darkens in breeding season and they get kind of a rusty patch on the shoulder and rusty pantaloons. Y'all that were in here early know my joke about pants. Okay, now let's talk about some saltwater birds, seabirds. This one right here, this magnificent frigate bird, is so cool. They don't have waterproof feathers, but they're a seabird. So you see this bill is long and hooked at the end, And they will fly over the water and pick things off the surface, but mostly what they do is kleptoparasitism. They steal from other birds. So they are only here in the summer months. And if you want to see these, go on the ferry, go to the back. The ferry is churning up all kinds of stuff that normally the birds wouldn't have access to. And the gulls and the pelicans are back there scooping it all up. And then this bird comes and steals it. Brown pelicans were endangered when I was young. We didn't have brown pelicans in Galveston, not a one when I was young. We had white pelicans in the winter. I had to go all the way to South Carolina when I was 16 to see a brown pelican. And they are everywhere now, right? They were endangered for the same reason bald eagles were endangered, because of the pesticide DDT getting into the water supply. The fish ingested that, the birds ingested the fish, and it made their eggshells so weak that when they would try to incubate them, they would crush them. So we reestablished our population from Louisiana and Mississippi. And then when the Deepwater Horizon oil spill happened, it devastated their populations. And we had to help reestablish them there. They are only saltwater and brackish, which is a mix of saltwater and freshwater. Red-breasted mergansers, these are ducks, but they don't have a typical duck bill. They have a very long bill that is serrated. You can see that in the Latin name here. And that is specialized for catching fish. They sit very, very low in the water, and they dive underwater and swim very fast in pursuit of fish. They like very clear water, and they are here in the winter months. So now's the time to see them. We also have birds that are considered underwater flyers. So very, very fast underwater. And one of the reasons why they're so fast is they also don't have waterproof feathers. So you often see them drying their wings. They'll go underwater and look for fish, and then they'll come up and they have to dry their wings. And that's true of both cormorants and anhingas. Our cormorants have a hook on the end of the bill. They pursue fish underwater very fast. They've got all of these have toed palmate feet. That means all 4 toes are webbed. So
Say that word.
toed palmate, like palmate. And then all of them. Most webbed feet birds, only the front 3 toes are webbed together and the hind toe is loose. But that gives them great paddling ability, and they are very, very fast, and they pursue fish underwater and they hook them with that bill. Neotropic cormorants are here year round. Double-crested cormorants come here in the winter months. They're a little bit larger. They can go a little bit deeper underwater, and they can go in much larger bodies of water. Anhingas are similar looking. People get them confused, but they've got a dagger-shaped bill. So they don't pursue fish. They're stealthy. They sneak up and they spear them from the side. Very stealthy.
So if you were gonna ID a neotropic or a double-crested cormorant, what would be the telltale for you?
The gular pouch is much brighter orange. That's that area on the throat that expands for catching fish. And they also have orange in front of the eye. They have an orange eyelid that goes between the eye and the beak. And the neotropic doesn't have that. This white V at the gape of the bill is in breeding season, and that helps for identification as well. Anhingas are freshwater only. So if you are out, let's say on the ferry, and you see a bunch of birds that are perched, they're going to be the cormorants and not anhingas, because that's a saltwater environment.
Are both the cormorant saltwater?
Yes, and
they're
freshwater.
both,
They're both.
yes.
So if you try to understand the habitat that you're in, it will help you figure out what kind of birds might be there. What kind of things can take advantage of that habitat, survive in that habitat. And when you're trying to learn identification of birds, it's a process of elimination. Like, oh, it's not that one, it's not that one, and eventually you'll end up with the right one. So when you get to a habitat, stop and just look for a while. Scan all parts of the habitat. If we're at a pond, There could be birds on the surface of the water. There could be birds diving into the water to get things. There could be birds skulking around the edges, flying overhead in nearby trees. So you'll see a lot more birds if you take the time to just scan the habitat and think to yourself, what kind of resources are here for birds? And birds are going to live in habitats that provide them with food and water, mostly fresh water. Some of the seawater species are able to extract the salt from the water with a special, I can't think of what it's called, but it's on their beak. And enough space to survive, and then shelter or cover, protection. And different species are going to match different environments. So again, a penguin, you can't take it and put it in the middle of the woods, right? It's not going to survive. So knowing which birds could be in a habitat is going to help you. And even within the same family group, each species has its own unique needs for survival. And so after this presentation, I'm going to do a bird's eye view on behavior, and you're going to see a lot of these birds in videos that we shot. So why would species within the same family have different lifestyles? Let's look at a couple that are in the swallow family, the cliff swallow and the purple martin. And this was shot in Manville. Do we have any cliffs in Manville? Do we? No, we do not. So they nest now in the overpasses. And then purple martins are the ones that people put up the purple martin houses. You have purple martin landlords. And so swallows are insectivores. They catch food on the wing. They're very fast in the air, very agile. And so they spend their time foraging over open rural areas and grasslands, prairies, parks. And they're cavity nesters that live in very close proximity to each other. And they are very susceptible to nest parasites for that reason. It goes from one nest to the next to the next to the next. And then also loss of habitat. So both of these birds have lifestyle adaptations that have helped them survive. Cliff swallows, they build their own nest like most swallows do. They grab little bitty beakfuls of mud. They go up and they attach it and they go back and get more and attach it until they build one of those mud nests. Purple martins are very beneficial to farmers and in neighborhoods because of pest control, right? So they eat a lot of mosquitoes. So you see people that want these birds in their area. They put up the purple martin houses, and this species has adapted over time to not build its own nest anymore. They completely rely on those man-made structures. And people that are very serious about being a purple martin landlord bring those down at the end of the season when the swallows leave us in the winter. They clean them, they sanitize them, and so they're getting all of those benefits. They get clean nesting areas every time, and they're being protected. So very different lifestyles, and they have adapted over time to take advantage of those. So understanding the lifestyle of the species will help you understand if it might be in that habitat or not. So let's look at the example. You see a black and white woodpecker in your trees, in oak trees, and you've got a small urban yard in Houston. And so once you look in your field guide, you think it could be a red cockaded woodpecker, or it could be a downy woodpecker. So the red cockaded woodpecker is completely dependent upon mature southern pine. Most woodpeckers create their cavities in dead trees or diseased trees, but this one carves them into live pine trees that have a lot of sap. And all of that sap that runs down traps insects and keeps predators from going in there. They also need pine trees that don't have a lot of understory, don't have a bunch of other stuff coming up underneath it. And they also need foraging trees. They're a colonial woodpecker. So when you find them, there's going to be a family group that's all living near each other, all with their own cavities, roosting cavities. And their habitat is very carefully managed by Texas Parks and Wildlife and other areas to keep that understory clear. And they mark the trees with white rings here in Texas to indicate this is a nesting habitat. Jones State Forest is a good place to go to find them, or Angelina State Forest. And so there will be many trees marked with that ring, but the one that's the active nest will have all of the wet sap around it. That's one way we can tell. So now that you know a little bit about its lifestyle, would you find that species in oak trees in your eastern yard? No, right?
Is the sap because of what they're doing to the tree, or is it they look?
Oh,
the tree-
good question. Yes, so they will create little sap wells that helps that drain down, and they'll keep those active. Thank you. Good question. Oh, and the fact that they're social, the birds from the previous brood will help the parents raise the young. And so the parents get the benefit of having help, and they are learning how to care for young and maturing enough so that once there is habitat, they can. Yeah.
So you gave us two species, this one and the
And the
downy.
downy woodpecker?
Would it have been the downy?
Yes, that's what I didn't put that up.
And I didn't think they were these guys.
Yeah, downy are very common in our area.
So where did the rain come from? I don't see any red on it.
This little teeny tiny bit of red right here. People who name birds come out like red-bellied woodpecker. They have a tiny little blush of red. And yellow-bellied sapsuckers, a tiny little blush of yellow. They are about to start renaming. Have y'all heard about that? They're going to rename all of the bird species that are named after people. So like Audubon's warbler or Bachman's sparrow. What?
Some more weird names.
It will, yeah, and they said they're going to make them descriptive.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, how many of you have field guides? Yay. So, field guides list birds in taxonomic sequence, so grouped by families with like characteristics. And they also have the oldest forms of birds in the front and the newest forms in the back. So as you progress, they're getting more and more and more complex. And that's based on what we know of evolutionary history, but it changes over time. The crested caracara is an amazing looking bird of prey, and they thought it was a hawk when I was young. You could find it with the hawk. And then for a period of time, they decided, no, it's more closely related to parrots. So they moved them as field guides. And then through DNA testing, they figured out they're falcons. So now they're with falcons. So older field guides are going to be in a slightly different order. Just, familiarize yourself with the one you have. And before looking in your guide, think about what kind of category. Is it a swimmer or an aerialist like gulls that spend a lot of time on the wing? Is it a wader? And there's long-legged waders like herons and cranes, or small waders like sandpipers. Game birds or fowl-like birds that live on the ground, grass, grouse, quail, turkeys. A bird of prey or a raptor, so that's hawks and eagles and owls, or birds that live in the trees, arboreal birds, and that could be songbirds, woodpeckers, hummingbirds. Okay, so now let's talk about migration. So although birds are very specific to their own habitat, changes to the environment force them to sometimes leave that habitat. And so more than any other group of animals, birds migrate to find better conditions. And some of them have amazing, thousands of miles that they migrate. And it's time to seasonal changes, and it's yearly. So you probably know birds move north in the spring and south in the winter. Of the 50 species of birds that nest here in North America, there's only about 100 that don't migrate. So most of our nesting species migrate. And birds migrate between Nearctic or North America and Neotropic or South American areas. Migration is incredibly hazardous. They are vulnerable to predation. They are vulnerable to lights on buildings, confusing them, and they fly into windows. If they hit a storm along the way, if suddenly there's a neighborhood where there used to be a big grazing area and now they don't have resources along the way. And so they migrate to try to find adequate resources to survive. North America is kind of shaped like a funnel. And so the southern area, kind of where we are, forms the tip. And it's estimated that 20 million songbirds migrate south for the winter. And that really increases crowding, right? They're a little more tolerant of each other in their habitat in the winter. But in the spring, they need space, they need resources to feed their young, and so they move back north. And so they've done a lot of studies to try to understand what spurs birds to migrate. And hormones are triggered when there's more light hours in the day. And those hormonal changes create hyperphagia, or the desire to eat, and they start bulking up ahead of time because they have to be able to store fat in order to survive the migration, have enough resources. And so a lot of omnivores shift from eating seeds to eating insects and caterpillars and things that are rich in proteins and fats before they undertake migration. And it takes some species longer to build that fat, so they have to start bulking up a lot sooner. Hormonal changes also create a desire to fly in a certain direction, and winds shift. In the spring, they shift to coming from the south, and they get that tailwind to push them northward. And in the fall, the opposite is true. The wind's coming from the north. And so in areas where the light doesn't change much, the hours of daytime, it's those wind changes that prompt them to start migrating. They can also sense changes in barometric pressure. And the lower part of our atmosphere is very turbulent. And that boundary lowers at night. And so birds are able to fly at lower altitudes with less turbulence. And it's cooler at night. Songbirds have power flight. They have to flap constantly, right? That takes so much energy. And so for that reason, they usually migrate at night. When it's cooler, there's not as much turbulence and they can get where they're going. There's not as many predators. And songbirds migrate 300 to 500 miles per night. There's also diurnal migrants. Those are the ones that migrate during the day. And those are large soaring birds that rely on the thermals. So you'll see big hawk migration. There's hawk towers that count the hawks that are passing through. And so they are large birds and they ride those thermals up and then use that to fly in different directions. And so things like white pelicans that are migratory migrate during the day. Laughing gulls and other gulls migrate during the day. But long distance migrants can fly up to 25,000 feet in the air and at speeds of up to 50 miles an hour. In spring, they have to migrate. They have to stop more along the way. In the fall, they usually, they just go, they make one trip. But in the spring, they need to be healthy and ready to breed when they get to their breeding range. So they make more stops along the way. And when I was young, I just assumed that the young birds learn the migration patterns from the older birds, right? But that's not true of songbirds. The parents leave and the young continue to bulk up and then they go. So they are likely to stray sometimes and you'll find them in strange areas. Birds orient themselves in the sky by paying attention to movement around a fixed point, which is the North Star. They did experiments raising birds in an observatory where they could change what was showing in the sky. and they raised them to orient around Beetlejuice. And so when they let those birds out, they were trying to orient and going in all crazy directions. They also have little magnetic particles in their beaks. And so they can sense magnetic lines. And so that helps them to orient themselves as they go. They can also hear infrasound like ocean waves, so they can orient themselves by that, or maybe like a forest, the sound of the wind blowing through the trees. And the ones that migrate during the day use visual landmarks. And so most of our rivers flow north to south. And so they can follow those rivers to migrate. But we still don't know a lot about migration. Genetic research has now isolated 60 genes on one chromosome that control migration. So we're going to be always learning about migration. Most birds here in Texas aren't year-round residents, and they're seasonal. And so they either are here winter or summer, or they're just passing through. And more than half of the birds that have been documented here in Texas are migrants. We are in the middle of two flyways used by North American birds, the Mississippi Flyway and the Central Flyway. So the Mississippi Flyway takes birds straight over the Gulf of Mexico, right over the Gulf. But the Central Flyway is for birds that want to circumnavigate the Gulf and go around it. And that's safer, right? If you're over land and you can find resources. But you'll notice we are right in the crosshatch. We get birds from both migration pathways. And we also get birds that stray off that end up in a strange area. But Texas is really important to migratory birds. And of the North American species listed as neotropical migrants, so those songbirds, 333 out of 338 have been documented here in Texas. Almost all of them. We do have year-round residents, and we do have birds that just move through very quickly during migration, which in spring is late March to mid-May, and in fall is September to November. And our area here along the upper Texas coast is critically important habitat. Birds use the uplands, the wetlands, the beaches, and the marshes to have cover, to rest, and to feed. And then nesting sites as well. Some of the coastal areas, have y'all heard the term migrant trap? Some of the coastal areas like High Island, maybe you've heard about High Island as one place. They consider migrant traps because if they're coming through in the spring and they hit a big storm, they're going to go to the first patch of wooded area they can find when they hit the coast, if they make it there. And so they will stop abruptly at the shore and seek shelter. And so when that happens in mass numbers, they call it a fallout because it looks like they're falling out of the sky. And you'll hear birders get very excited. Oh, there's going to be a fallout. I hate fallouts. So many birds die. Along our beaches, you can find dead songbirds when that happens. And so it's very traumatic for the birds. So I try to keep that in mind. And many of them don't make it. We also have important wintering habitat for migrants that come from the north and overwinter with us. Loons and grebes and shorebirds and ducks, gulls, hawks, thrushes, warblers, sparrows, all of those come into our area in the winter. And so in the winter, we have way more variety than we do the rest of the year. And species from the south come here in the summer to nest here. So things like flycatchers, like our beautiful scissor-tail flycatchers, swallows and warblers and orioles, they come here to nest here. How am I doing on time? Are you keeping track?
It is 9:49.
I don't know if that's good. We started at 9. Good. So there's a lot of important habitats for migrants. We're going to one today, right? The Brazoria National Wildlife Refuge. San Bernard National Wildlife Refuge is also worth a visit. The Gulf Coast Bird Observatory runs Quintana Neotropical Bird Sanctuary. And if you're interested in getting volunteer time, we do what's called a spring fling, where we're there to greet people. People come from all over the world to see the birds at Quintana. And so we're there to greet people. We keep a list of what's been seen. We help volunteer to be kind of a liaison for the birds in that area. Houston Audubon has Bolivar Flat Shorebird Sanctuary, which is internationally recognized as an important site for wintering shorebirds. Aransas National Wildlife Refuge is the one I mentioned earlier, that is whooping cranes. And High Island Bird Sanctuary, if you go across the ferry to Bolivar, and once the road turns and starts heading northward, you run into High Island. And it has a ton of migratory birds. And there's also rookeries there where thousands of egrets and herons and roseate spoonbills nest. And then Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge as well. And it's a bit of a jaunt from our area. We usually take the ferry and go around to get to it, but you can take I-10. I hate I-10. So bird populations are limited or reduced by 4 factors: the habitat that they're in, the climate, food and water availability, and disease and parasites. And any ecosystem includes both the physical habitat and the organisms within it. And organisms change the ecosystem just by being in it. I mean, if you think about humans, we really have an impact on our ecosystems, right? But so do birds and other animals. They can alter conditions in the habitat by adding resources. If you think about seed dispersal, right? Or subtracting resources. They're eating everything in sight, maybe. And how they interact with other birds or other creatures within that habitat. And then, of course, the physical environment itself may change due to things not related to the organism, so abiotic. And that could be climatic variations that affect temperature and food availability. We just had a huge rainstorm, right? There's water everywhere in the habitat right now. That's beneficial for some birds. Waders love that. But other birds that needed that soil habitat are going to be pushed out, right? And so within bird communities, they have to interact with each other within a community so they can all survive and try to survive. And so there's a lot of interactions that go on, including competition and predation. Competition is just when species are competing for the same resources, and that may reduce the availability of a resource. And that's probably the most important factor in determining the structure in a community. And so competition can be aggression toward other individuals. Our white-tailed white-winged dove that's a bully, for instance, so that they push out those little Inca doves and exclude them. More commonly, exploitation competition, where one individual suffers from reduced resources because the others are there. And birds compete for food, nest sites, nest materials, mates, and territories. And territories that they are trying to protect contain one or more of the other resources. So species participate in resource partitioning. If you think about a pond, if everything was trying to go for the same fish in that pond, it'd be very difficult, right? So some of them are eating other things that are in the pond. Some of them are eating vegetation, but they're partitioning the resources. Warblers partition within a single tree. You've got some warblers that prefer to feed very low to the ground, some in the mid canopy, and some way up high. We call it warbler neck because you're trying to see them up that high. But they will defend their territories, and they can be a nesting territory, or they can be a feeding territory. If you have hummingbird feeders, ruby-throated hummingbirds are fiercely aggressive at protecting their feeder, right? And so they protect just that one resource, food. But breeding territories usually include food and mates and nest size. And the size of a bird's territory is going to depend on population density and availability of resources. So in gull colonies where there's thousands of birds, they just protect the little area right around their own nest. But bald eagles, they need a lot of resources to survive and feed their young. They have a huge territory. And they do sometimes get antagonistic with each other, but for the most part, birds avoid physical contact. So usually you'll see displays of threat where they'll puff up and try to look larger, or submission, where they. And you'll see birds mobbing. Have you ever seen that when there's a predator in the area to call attention to the predators flocking? They also will do cavity nesting, which is more protected, or colonies where they have their safety in numbers. And so some of them have smaller clutches of eggs so that they don't get as many predators. Mobbing is when small birds will attack a larger bird, like a hawk or an owl. And people think, well, why don't they just reach out and grab them, right? How are they safe doing that? If you think about raptors, they catch things with their beak. So if they're sitting up on the top of a tree or a high line and there's birds attacking them from above, there's really not much they can do. And that's mostly common around breeding territories. And it's, trying to get the predator to go away. And then they also make a bunch of noise when they're doing that to call attention to all the other things that are in the habitat. Hey, they're the predator. And so other birds may join in and start mobbing them too. You also see some of them doing injury displays. Killdeer are kind of famous for that, where they do a broken wing display and they try to lead you away from the nest. They nest on the ground in really shallow depressions in really bad places like along trails or the side of the road. And so if you get too close to their nest, they'll start acting injured to try to draw the predator away from the nest. Other birds will crouch down and dart back and forth and try to confuse the predators. Cavity nesting is really good for birds because they get a lot of protection inside that cavity. And so 1/2 of all orders of birds build nests inside cavities or holes. And that's much safer than having a nest out in the open, even within a tree, or on the ground like those killdeer. And so nest placement and construction are very important because the largest cause of nesting failure is predation. And they also can adjust their clutch size or how many eggs they lay in the nest. That is a red-headed woodpecker. They were common when I was young, and now you hardly ever see them.
Never seen them.
Yeah. So some birds will lay a small clutch so that if they get attacked by predators and they lose them all, they can still lay eggs again and have a second clutch. And in order to not have the smell attract predators to the nest and tip them off, they'll remove eggshells from the nest after the eggs hatch. They will remove fecal sacs and carry them off so that it keeps it a little bit cleaner and it's not attracting predators. Colonial nesting birds, like those thousands of gulls, have kind of safety in numbers, right? But some colonies expose the birds to even greater predation. And it's widespread among taxonomic orders of birds. So seagulls, house sparrows, herons, egrets, blackbirds, all are colonial nesters. And they can detect predators more easily, a lot of eyes to see them and call attention to them. And they can form larger mobs to drive them out. But predation is heavier on the nest on the outside of the colony. And so the older birds, more experienced, are nesting on the inside of that colony where it's more protected. And it's the young birds that are more likely to have nest failure around the edges. There's also something called predator saturation. And so eggs and young birds are a significant food source for predators. And they're only available for a very brief time. So if they're all in this huge colony and they're all laying eggs at the same time and the young at the same time, the predators can't increase their population enough to take advantage of all of that resource. Birds also have a lot of parasites and microscopic pathogens like bacteria and viruses. They're subject to lice and fleas, louse flies, things that are similar to bed bugs, ticks, and mites. And so ectoparasites, ecto for external parasites that live on birds' bodies, can greatly increase nestling mortality. So we talked about those cliff swallow nestlings, where those bedbug-like things are going from nest to nest to nest. And so they'll just pick up and move their, they won't nest in the same area. So you may see hundreds of nests one year, and then the next year there's none there. Birds like European starlings will line their nest materials. They'll line their nest with materials that inhibit bacteria and ectoparasites. So they'll use things like yarrow, and the sprigs provide kind of pest control for them. And so starlings can withstand large populations of nestlings. Some species reuse their nests from year to year, and others will build new nests, like the cliff swallow.
Is yarrow, is that a native plant?
I don't know if we have it here. A good question.
I saw some.
Yeah.
Is that Yarrow?
Yeah. Birds that come to your backyard bird feeders are also very susceptible to diseases that are spread through shared food and conditions that encourage disease. So here we have a lot of humidity, and if you have bird seed in your feeder, it can mold and mildew and make birds sick. And there's 4 common diseases: salmonellosis, which is like our salmonella that makes us sick, trichomoniasis, aspergillosis, and avian pox. Salmonellosis is caused by bacteria that spreads throughout the body, and it makes abscesses on the esophagus. And it's passed from the infected bird. They have droppings, and that exposes other birds to it. And so do you remember a couple of years ago, they were telling everybody, take down your bird feeders. There's pine siskins everywhere that have this salmonellosis. Those usually are birds that are widespread in an area, and they have that naturally in their gut, but whenever they're under stress, it increases, and food sources were wiped out in their normal areas, and it pushed them into our area, and they were looking for food at feeders, and that superficially grouped them very closely, and then they were spreading it to all the other birds. And that's the most frequent bird feeder disease. There's also a group of protozoan parasites that cause trichomoniasis, and that afflicts pigeons and doves, and particularly mourning doves. And that causes sores in the mouth and the throat. They try to eat things but can't. They drop it out, and then that food's eaten by another bird, and it passes it from bird to bird. If you do have damp feed and debris beneath your feeder and you don't keep it clean, you can get a fungus that's called aspergillosis, and the bird inhales those fungal spores and it spreads throughout their lungs, and that causes pneumonia and bronchitis. Avian pox is a lot more noticeable. It causes these horrible growths on the bare parts of their skin. And if you come in direct contact with each other, it spreads from bird to bird. So if you see a bird near your feeder, the pine siskins, for instance, I had so many of my friends that were not birders that would be like, "Oh, this little bird's so tame," and he just stayed there and was, and I'm like, "It's sick, don't touch it." And they're like, "No, I brought it in, I put it in a box." I'm like, "It's gonna die," and it did, And I say, "It's not what you did; it was gonna die anyway." But they are less alert and less active. Most birds won't let you walk right up to them, right? So if they do, something's wrong. And so it's important to make sure you have enough space around your feeders, that you keep them clean, and clean the feeders. You can use a very weak bleach solution to clean them. And then make sure that you're giving them fresh and dry food that is not got mold and stuff in it. Habitat alteration can also can cause decline in populations. And so things like our urban encroachment that takes away nesting habitat or decreases resources in an area, that negatively impacts birds. And in some species, changes in habitat have increased numbers, like those white-winged doves and the black-bellied whistling ducks. But there's a concern about the effect that has on other species within the habitat. So Texas Parks and Wildlife and other places like that use habitat management to try to restore areas to the preferred habitat for birds. And so sometimes they'll introduce fire through prescribed burns to create that secondary growth. They will also, fragmentation of habitat is very serious. If a bird needs a large habitat to survive and there's all just little pockets of areas, they can't survive like that. And it also provides predator corridors. If you think about like a wooded area, the birds at the edges are going to be the least safe, right? Because you can see them, predators can see them. So when they're putting in these neighborhoods, everywhere there's a break in that habitat is an edge where predators can now get to them. Obviously, food supply isn't a constant, unchanging resource. And so it changes from season to season and year to year with changes in the weather. So if it gets really cold, it may kill all the insects that were available, or it may wipe out all of the vegetation, right? With freeze that we just had. And so population size is going to be impacted by changes to the availability of food. Some birds, though, adapt their behavior to be able to survive when there's changes. Acorn woodpeckers make a granary tree, and they go out and get acorns and they peck them into the trees and they use them year after year, and it's like a food pantry for them. And loggerhead shrikes, have y'all seen the little, someone once called them an evil little cutie, and so
I had kids in my neighborhood was like gonna be a serial killer. I didn't know why. I kept having small snakes and lizards impaled. And then we figured it out and it's like we solved the
Yeah.
like,
They're a predator, but they're a songbird. So they have a hooked beak, but little bitty songbird beak. They can't hold things still like our raptors can. And so they impale them to hold them for them. So they'll be around places with thorn bushes and barbed wire. You're going to see a lot of them. And they also, like, they can eat monarchs, which are toxic, because they'll impale them. They'll wait a few days till the toxins dissipate, and then they're able to eat them. And birds in Cididae, Parodidae, and Corvidae, so things like crows and blue jays and nuthatches, make seed caches, and they'll accumulate leftovers and store them. And so things like blue jays will bury things in the ground, and maybe they remember where some of them are and go back and eat them, and maybe they don't, and you have an oak tree coming up in the middle of your yard. And then some species will disperse to a different habitat. So things like those pine siskins that had a food shortage in their normal area were pushed into our area. Do you remember 2 or 3 years ago, there was like thousands of robins everywhere, right? And then, but no other time, right? You see a few. It's because the wooded areas that they normally foraged in were devastated by some kind of blight that was going on, and it pushed them all into our area. So that year they were everywhere.
Remember that distinctly and wondered why they didn't come back.
Yeah. And those red-headed woodpeckers are, they follow food sources. So if you have a lot of the acorns and beech nuts and things like that that they're looking for, they'll be in your area one year, and then the next year you may not see them. It may be 3 or 5 years later. They can alter their, that's a great egret chick. They can alter their territory size if needed to like take advantage of a wider area for food availability. And birds like that red-cockaded woodpecker, where the young engage in cooperative feeding of the young when food is limited. And if food's insufficient, they may not be able to adequately nourish their chicks, and the smallest of the brood may starve or get bullied by large ones. So that's that sibling rivalry that we were talking about with the egrets. And of course, environmental conditions can affect the timing of reproduction. Female birds can actually delay egg production until there's enough resources to be able to lay them, and they'll wait to lay their eggs. But if they have a lot of resources available, some birds will have 2 to 3 broods in a year. Cardinals will have 2 broods in a year. They'll raise 2 sets of young. And some year-round availability will allow a lot of tropical species to do that as well. Let's see. Some species will have, instead of being monogamous, they'll engage in polyandry. They'll mate with more birds in order to be able to have more young. This is a northern harrier. When I was young, it was called a marsh hawk. You see them flying very low over the wetland areas and coastal prairies, and they tip in the air, and they're listening. They have an owl-like shield on their face. They're listening for birds or rodents that are in the prairie area. And so you hardly ever see the gray ones. The males are gray and the females are brown because they nest on the ground. So that helps camouflage them. And so you rarely see the males, so they call them gray ghosts. You'll hear people say, oh, it's a gray ghost. They're talking about a male northern harrier. And they mate with several females because there's not as many males, but they're excellent fathers. They provide food to all of the mates and all of the nests that are going at the same time. They work very hard. Birds are warm-blooded, like us, endothermic, and so they maintain relatively high body temperatures no matter what's going on in the environment. And so that's how they're able to live in tropics and polar zones and temperate zones like we're in. They regulate their body temperature, called thermoregulation, whenever temperatures are either too warm or too cool. You'll see birds like this double-crested cormorant, there's that orange eyelord, fluttering their gular pouch. It's like panting in a dog. It releases heat because they don't sweat. Birds don't sweat.
Can you say the name of that pouch again?
Gular, G-U-L-A-R, gular pouch.
Thank you.
And turkey vultures, which, believe it or not, are incredibly clean birds, they cool themselves by urinating down their legs. Yeah.
Incredibly clean.
Yeah, but I know. And yet. And so birds can be really susceptible to high heat stress. And so they'll use the panting, and evaporative cooling is what the turkey vultures are doing. In order to stay warm, some birds select microclimates that provide shelter. So those McCartney rose bushes that you see everywhere, or hedges provide a lot of protection from the elements. And the nest sites and cavities and burrows can protect them from the elements. And a lot of birds, like our northern bobwhite, will huddle together, and there's warmth with all of the bodies together to stay warm. So birds, like all organisms, are connected in some way to all of the individuals in their area, whether it's in the same species or in other species. And so if there's a certain kind of bird in an ecosystem, it can affect the diversity of the population. So this is an American kestrel, and they're our smallest North American falcon, and they come into the area in winter. And so in winter months, those smaller things sometimes move. And so, or birds like peregrine falcons that feed on other birds, that will impact the bird population within the environment. They affect vegetation by eating it or by flattening it down. Invertebrate populations that they're feeding on, and then also the vertebrate populations of an ecosystem. So they have a lot of roles within an ecosystem. They function as predators, and that helps some species from becoming too abundant. Predators will often remove the sick and old and more vulnerable birds, and that leaves the healthiest birds for the breeding population. And prey species, with things people think of as game birds, serve as a food source for other animals within that ecosystem. And that can include eggs taken from the nest, or adults serving as a food source for larger predators like humans that go out and shoot doves and quail and things like that. And most predation on birds, though, occurs when they're young, either as an egg or a nestling. Humans do seek out a lot of game birds. And so things like that poor lesser prairie chicken that now you can hunt is impacted. Birds also function in seed dispersal within ecosystems. So birds that have really thick bills that exploit seeds, they can crush them, will eat a bunch of them, but they can't process them all. And so they'll fly from one area to another. Whenever they poop it out, they're leaving seeds behind, and that can cause vegetation to grow in other areas. I mentioned earlier, blue jays actually store seeds in the ground, and so they don't always get them all back out. Birds can also function as pollinators. Hummingbirds and orioles feed on nectar. And so while they're doing that, they're getting all of that pollen on their head and their necks and backs. And then they go feed on another flower, and it's pollinating the other flowers. And that ensures that those plants will produce offspring, which is plants and seeds and fruits. And that helps the ecosystem and, of course, birds in the future. We often monitor birds, and we do that in a variety of ways. There are point counts that may have predetermined areas that, we know these specific birds nest in this area, so we're going to go to that area and just count from right there. And they will count any birds they can see and hear from that point. And that helps us determine population trends and bird densities. There's also transects where they have a line that they have for maybe a mile or 2 miles. And so it's anything you can see or hear from that line. And then the ones that are studied, they do it annually so they can see over time how is population changing, what other species are there. Rare birds cause a lot of excitement, and there are rare bird reports that document birds that suddenly appear somewhere it's not thought to be normal. And you can report them through eBird. They are very carefully screened. They want documentation, description, photos. And if the Texas Bird Records Committee accepts them, then they will accept that rare bird. we saw a great blackback gull and in Quintana on Bryan Beach. And when we were there, there's a lot of lesser blackback gulls. And they had said there's one really huge lesser blackback gull out there. Don't be fooled. So when we were birding, I took videos of it for my classes and everything. And then when I got home, I was like, that's a great blackback gull. And so, I triple checked it. And then I checked with Ron Weeks, who is one of the eBird compilers. And I texted him. I was like, it's me again. I haven't bugged you in a while, but I really think I saw a great blackback gull. Can you look at my pictures? And he looked at him. He said, yeah, I think you're right. Submit it. So I did, and I got a notification recently that they were meeting and reviewing all the photos, and they appreciated that I gave them photos with the, wings raised, and I was taking screenshots from my video, but they approved it. I was so excited. But a lot of birders are somewhat crazy. There's people that are chasers. Have any of you seen The Big Year? That's real life. That was based on real people. I mean, slightly exaggerated. But there's people that if there's a rare bird, they're going to go and find it. And
see the camera.
yes, I went and found the cattle tyrant. We were on our way to the valley, and that bird was just ridiculously easy to see. They're like, go park behind this sushi restaurant, check the dumpsters, and there it was. But I wonder, that's a bird that has never been seen north of Panama. It's 2,600 miles out of range. What's going to happen to that bird? There's no other birds. It's probably just going to die. I mean, it had a lot of food. It was eating flies like crazy. It could just pick them out of the air. But they won't transplant it. Now, if it's a bird like a whooping crane, we had a pair of whooping cranes that showed up in Jefferson County in Winnie several years ago. It was a young male and a female, and they were banded. They were from the Louisiana population, and they thought they would go back at some point. The male disappeared. The female was still there. They actually got her and moved her back because she's an endangered species. Let's see. You can participate in a lot of citizen science surveys like that Christmas bird count, which goes on for 2 to 3 weeks. There's a 20-mile area in a circle, and so there's a lot of different ones you can participate in. Breeding bird survey is done where they go out to see how many birds are nesting and what's there. And then coming up mid-February, the Great Backyard Bird Count. And it's kind of a misnomer. You can report what you're seeing in your yard, but they also encourage you to go to other areas. We love to go to areas within Manville and Pearland. A lot of people go to Brazos Bend, and so there's all of these reports of Brazos Bend, right? But Manville, it's just me some years reporting what we're seeing out there. And the results come in real time. You can go to the Great Backyard Bird Count. It's run by Cornell University, and you can see other people's reports coming in from all over the world. It's pretty cool. And they rely on people just like us to get out there and document things and report that. And you can count that as volunteer time. The Christmas bird count, you could count your travel time when you're doing volunteer work. So we were able to count from when we got up in the morning and left the house at 5 all the way till when we got back at 8. I mean, that's a huge amount of volunteer time in one day. Okay, let's see. And we report through eBird, which is a reporting tool where you can put what species you're seeing and how many you're seeing. And you can also go on eBird and see what other people have reported, not necessarily real time. Yes.
Do you also enter things in iNaturalist?
I don't, because I resisted eBird until 2021, when it just became ridiculous for me not to use it. I kept all these little, notepads. I have them going back to my childhood. That is of no use to anyone but me, right? It doesn't have numbers. It just says species. And so I do a lot of guided bird tours. And when I got to the point where I was having to create spreadsheets to send things to people of what we had seen, it was just ridiculous. So I started using eBird. So I constantly have my face in my phone, which is not cool.
You said that some of the bird counts can count for volunteer time. Those are specifically the backyard bird
Yep.
count
You can count that.
events. But I mean, like outside of that, only the big ones that they do through like eBird
Yeah,
or
yeah, like, we're constantly out reporting in eBird, but I can't report all those hours constantly.
yeah.
They do have like a limit, like you could report some volunteer time, but it's limited how much you can do. Okay. That was the part from the book. And we're going to have another presentation of bird behavior. But do y'all have any questions about what we just talked
How common are bald eagles in this area?
about? Oh, now they're
Nesting
very
here.
common. They're another one that when I was young, I had to go to North Texas to see bald eagles. You could see them around the Dallas area. And they also were impacted by DDT, making their eggshells break down. So once they stopped that and they made it where you couldn't hunt them, people were hunting them, they have bounced back. And so there's a nesting pair in Pearland, Webster, Cullinan Park in Fort Bend County, Bar X Ranch.
There's a nesting pair in
Around-
Danbury right next to my house right now.
Yeah, and so we kind of keep those close to the vest. We won't just tell everybody where they can go find an eagle nest, because they might get, harassed, and they're still protected. But yeah, they're everywhere now. I see them flying over 288 all the time. I get really excited. Yeah, if you're distracted by birds, pull over, but you're fine.
They have bumper stickers now.
My husband wants one that says, we not break for birds, but
Like go around, I'm birding.
yeah. Any other questions? All right, let's take a break. Everybody go to the bathroom, and then we will switch to the other presentation. Okay, you guys, this is my favorite part. So, when my husband and I are out in the field, we like to shoot videos of cool behavior, and we go out at all times of the day in all kinds of weather. And you'll hear people say, "Oh, go out in the morning." I am not a morning person. It's one of the great ironies of my life. Guess what? Birds are out all day, doing their business, and some of them are more active in the evenings. They're out there. They don't care if it's raining, right? They're out there in the rain. So we go out if it's, a freeze. We go out if it's pouring rain. And so we see a lot of behavior. And so these are all videos that my husband and I shot. I'm going to kind of narrate what we're seeing. A lot of these are the birds I was talking about in the other presentation. And it's going to show you the diversity of how even within the same family group, birds have their own behaviors and are after their own resources.
And these are all your videos.
These are all our personal videos. So does anybody know what this bird is?
Reddish egret.
Yes, a reddish egret. It's one of my favorites. So y'all find out
Really
why.
cute. Behavior wise.
They look drunk, don't they? Okay. This is Galveston's East End Lagoon off Boddicker Road, early in the morning at sunrise. And here you can see there's a lot of activity, right? There are birds that are in the water, swimming on the surface. There's birds diving into the water to get food. There's birds that are going underwater, like the cormorants. There's herons and egrets along the edges. And then there are gulls trying to steal things from that little birds. But very active. And so they're resource partitioning. Even though there's hundreds of birds, they're going after different things within the habitat. I may have to do this from here. This is in Hitchcock. So if you come back from Galveston over the causeway, right when you get to the base of the causeway on the mainland side, Hitchcock has what is mostly a freshwater pond, but it's brackish. And so you can again see birds in the edges. You can see a lot of birds swimming. You can see birds diving down to the water. But what I want to call your attention to are these white pelicans. They're only here in the winter months, and they're very passive feeders. They just paddle along, scooping up fish out of the water. Once they get a fish in their pouch, they have to kind of get control of it. there's a gull coming in trying to steal from them. But very passive, paddling along and just scooping fish up. And then once they get control of it, they'll swallow it and wash it down with a little bit of water. This behavior is cooperative foraging. And so they are herding fish into the center of that group. They're holding their wings up out of the water so they don't get wet. And here, this was right at the mouth of the river. And so all of that wave action is bringing prey into very shallow water, and they're forcing the prey into the center to scoop it up. So cooperative feeding in the white pelicans.
Yeah, you've got the one rebel on the side.
Yeah, we call him Joey. They migrate in these big, long, undulating lines. But what I want you to look for while you're out there, they form vortex in the air, riding those thermals. It's called wheeling. And every time they go around and the light hits their wings, you can see a flash of white, and then they disappear when they go around. So you can see that from a great distance and know you're looking at white pelicans. Looks like they just appear and then disappear.
And what is it that they're doing?
They're getting ready to come down to an area to roost for the night. Yes. Brown pelicans, on the other hand, are saltwater birds. You see them fly very low over the surface of the water because there's less turbulence, helps them conserve energy. And they, like many birds, have one bird at the beginning that's breaking that wind current and passing that energy savings. They have a dramatic foraging style because they're saltwater specialists, very deep water. They go up into the air and then corkscrew down and hit the water with a percussive shock that stuns the fish, and they can just scoop them. So, yeah, I want to make the sounds too. Very dramatic. White pelicans, are in very shallow lake habitats throughout North America. So they can't do that. And so here I slowed it down for you.
So the brown pelicans are up only on the coast?
Yes.
They don't
Right.
north.
Yep, only along the coastline. And so once they stun the fish, they just scoop them up. They look for like a school of fish near the surface when they're diving down like that. And then again, they've got to get control of it and get a little drink of water to wash it down. And then they're very heavy, lifting off into the air. So they kind of need a runway across the water. This is that magnificent frigate bird. There's a couple of them in here, but this is behind the ferry, all of the action going on. And watch this massive bird, 7-foot wingspan, the shape of the wings being very pointed and the tail very pointed. They are very agile in the air. They are able to just outpower these other birds, and they're going to turn and try to take something from those gulls. Oh, got it that time. It's got one of those long, what do you call those fish? Ribbon fish.
Oh, okay.
So let's watch that again. So it's going to come around, much easier for it to change position in the air. You'll see them open the tail up and then just steals it. And then it's just going to slurp it down in midair and go back. And here I just slowed it down so we could see it. Look at those wings.
They expend a lot of energy.
Yes, right. And those wings are so big that they can't get up out of the water. If they get those wings wet, they're not able to lift themselves up off the water. So these poor laughing gulls don't stand a chance.
And they are exclusively feeding off of another bird's work.
They sometimes will scoop things off the surface of the water, but mostly kleptoparasitism. And summer is when we have all of them. And so if you ride the ferry in the summer, you can see up to 7 at a time. It's amazing. And my husband shot this. If birds are in the air, I have a hard time following them. But if it's flying and it's like all over the place, my husband did that. Okay, so these are surface feeding ducks. They have webbed feet, so they're paddling. There are some mottled ducks that look a lot like female mallards, and there's some teal, blue-winged teal. And they forage on vegetation in very shallow areas. So you'll see them tip up and put their rump in the air and their head underwater so they can reach vegetation underneath. And they'll also try to stir things up with their feet. Yeah, duck butts. These are also surface feeding ducks. These are northern shovelers, and they have a behavior that looks a little bit like a pinwheel, or one of my students called it a do-si-do. The male and female will form this circular pattern that brings aquatic invertebrates up out of the muck at the bottom. This is off of the Levee Road in Freeport, and we saw this huge group of them cooperatively feeding, making a huge vortex to bring food up, and then you can see pairs off at the side as well. But they're the only ones that do that, of the surface feeding. This is a common loon. When they're in our area, they're pretty plain. In the winter months, non-breeding plumage. They have solid bones. Most birds have hollow bones to make them very lightweight. So they sit very low in the water. They're able to dive up to 250 feet deep and stay underwater for up to 5 minutes. They're usually diving constantly. These had just eaten. So we were able to video them. This is off of the Texas City Dike. It's a great place to go see them right now. Or off its bayou in Galveston, you can see them off. And they do eat fish, which they have to eat head first when they bring them up to the surface so it doesn't puncture their throat. These are those red-breasted mergansers, so saltwater species. They're diving ducks. They are foraging cooperatively, driving fish forward, going underwater to catch them. You'll often see them being harassed by gulls that are trying to steal the fish they're bringing up.
What are y'all using to record?
Just a regular old Canon PowerShot and Nikon Z50. We do not have great equipment. But you can see they've got very shaggy crests. That one has an attitude. She goes over there and tells them off. So they have that bouffant heritage. This is a neotropic cormorant. So you saw it drying its wings. You can get a good look at those totopalmate feet, so fully webbed, and then that hook on the end of the bill. They've got a beautiful turquoise eye. I love seeing their eyes. So no waterproof feathers. They don't have oil glands like other birds. And so this one is just perched up looking to see if it wants to get in the water and start fishing, if there's any fish around. Actively look at her.
How long do birds live?
It depends. You know, some only live a year or two, and some live 20, 30 years. Some of the larger
Bird
birds.
or cardinal?
Probably just a few years, yeah. These are neotropic cormorants that have migrated in for the winter. This is in Bay Street Park at Texas City at the base of the dike. There's a huge, mostly freshwater pond, little brackish. But as they were coming in, notice they're flying very low over the surface of the water where it's not as turbulent. They're in that loose V formation. And then they come and join each other in the water. And because they don't have waterproof feathers, they sit very low in the water. Good way to recognize them. And so what they're doing, you can just see wave after wave after wave. They're coming in, landing, and all facing in the same direction, and they form what's called a raft. So rafting. And not all birds do that, but they are cooperative feeders. And so again, once they form that raft, they're going to drive the prey in front of them as a large group.
You said these were neotropic cormorants?
Yeah, these are neotropic.
Do double-crested cormorants do the same behavior with rafting?
Yes, they do. We just don't get as great a numbers of them. But you can see just more and more and more. They were coming off all those piers in the background and coming over to start feeding. This is early in the morning. This is the anhinga. So different beak shape. It's got a dagger-shaped beak. It does have those total palmate feet or completely webbed. People call these snake birds. Long neck, long tail, and they tend to move their necks around a lot. This is a female. Males are completely dark instead of having that brown. She's gonna take off at some point, but she's checking everything out.
Are they like in the same class or?
Yeah, they're underwater flyers. So
As
again,
as the cormorant?
as a
Yeah,
cormorant,
okay.
yeah.
Is this the same type of bird that the fishermen in parts of Asia
That's
use?
cormorants,
Just
yeah.
cormorants? Okay.
So look at the difference in the swimming. Stealthy, right?
Yeah, that's
Mm.
totally different.
And when they're in the water, their entire body is submerged. Only their neck sticks out. You can see that snake bird. They propel themselves forward with that jutting motion. So you can tell you're looking at an anhinga, not a cormorant. And when they go underwater, they can stay underwater a very long time. So we're waiting here thinking, you know, it's going to come back up. Maybe it's going to come back up. And then eventually it comes up way over to the other side of us.
Where was that at?
And there. This is at the Trinity River Recreational Area.
Pretty like back.
Yeah. So Trinity River Recreation Area. Off I-10, like exit 805 is JJ Mays. What was that?
I thought you did,
I do. Okay, so these are ring-billed gulls. There's a couple of laughing gulls mixed in, but when they do actually forage on their own, they're kind of passive. They just wander along in shallow water, looking for things they can pick out of the water.
Not trying to get you.
Not trying to steal anything. Yeah, French fries in the parking lot. So pretty passive feeding style when they are actively foraging on their own. This is during the freeze of 2021 when Uri came through and it cold stunned all the fish. This is on Bryan Beach on Quintana Island. There were, yes, it was like Oprah, you know, you get a fish and you get a fish. And so it was ridiculously cold this day, but we went out on the beach and we got to see this. And so it's going to swallow that fish whole. Again, it needs to be head first so that it doesn't puncture anything in the throat. And then it's going to just wash it down with a little bit of water. These are terns. Terns have a much different bill shape, dagger-shaped, big, very long wings. These are Forster's terns. And terns have to work very hard for a living. Terns dive headfirst into the water. You won't see gulls ever diving headfirst into the water. This is one bathing. Anytime a bird's bathing or preening, it's a great opportunity to look at all the field marks. You can see Forsters have very long outer tail feathers. So forked tails, Forsters have a forked tail. And they're here year-round.
You said year-round?
Yeah. These are Forster's terns foraging. So again, going up into the air, looking for fish and diving in head first into the water. So you can tell they're terns and not gulls. The ones with the big orange beaks are royal terns, but coming in and stealing the show is a sandwich tern. They have black bills with yellow tips like they dipped them in mustard. And so because they have to work very hard, the male is bringing a fish to the female to show it, I'm a good mate, I can provide for you and the young. They do a beautiful little courtship dance. See how he's got his wings around her? And then she accepts his advances and they fly out.
Very romantic.
Yes. These are black skimmers. And this is on East Beach after it had rained and they're bathing very enthusiastically. Skimmers have an amazing beak structure. The lower mandible is longer than the top mandible, gives them a very odd look. And they have very long wings. Those are their wings that are sticking out. So very agile in the air. And they were enjoying that fresh water source after a rain.
Skimming on the side.
And so they're called skimmers because of their feeding behavior. They will go along and fly and catch fish just by dragging that lower mandible in the water. When they feel something, they snap it shut and grab it. And you'll see them flying in one direction and then they'll turn around and come back the other way. So if you see them, don't be disappointed if they fly away very quickly because they'll come back. This is in Brazoria National Wildlife Refuge. This is a freshwater area. You've got a lot of white ibis and a lot of roseate spoonbill. So if you see a big pink bird here, more likely than not, it's a roseate spoonbill. They're pink because of the food they eat, because of the beta carotene in the shrimp and crustaceans, and they forage by feel. They sweep that odd-shaped bill back and forth in the water, and then when they find something to eat, they'll snap it up in the air and eat it like popcorn. Just like that. The white ibis also forages by feel. That long down curved bill gives them the ability to reach prey very deep under mud or in water on the surface of the pond. And that gives them an ecological advantage. They can find more food and they have a very sensitive bill tip.
So I have a lot of white ibises in and around my yard right now because it's all flooded.
Yeah.
Everybody's come in. But there's a lot of times glossy ibis mixed in.
White-faced. But the young white ibis are brown. So they're probably
Okay,
the young.
okay.
Yeah.
I've noticed like an increase in, I have had white ibises in my yard for like the last year or so. I don't think I'd ever noticed
Probably
them
more
foraging in my
freshwater,
yard
yeah.
before. I live right on Mary's Creek. So, I mean, it's not,
Yeah.
but it's just, I've lived there for 7 years and they've never been
That many.
like hanging
Yeah.
out and eating in my yard before the last year. So I felt happy. Maybe they're doing better. Or
Yeah.
something.
So this is a great egret. Anytime a bird has great in the name, it's the largest of that family group. This is about 3 feet tall. They have that very long neck. Let me see if I can make that view. And they're very stealthy. They just kind of stalk things very slowly. They use that S-shaped neck to be able to dart out and get something that looks like it might be too far away. They've got that big dagger-shaped beak, so they can eat larger things, aquatic invertebrates and things like that. Very slow and methodical foraging style. This is in Lafitte's Cove in Galveston. And we saw this one eating a Gulf Coast ribbon snake. So we had to stop and see if it really could eat that. And so watch its positioning in it to try to eat the snake head first, trying to gulp it down. But the snake fights back by wrapping itself around the bill, holding the bill shut. And so at a certain point, it has to drop it because it's all knotted up. And then start over again, repositioning it, trying to get it head first. This went on for a very long time. I edited down a lot. And so just when it looks like maybe it's going to win and actually manage to eat it, no, the snake wins another round. It wraps itself around the beak and has to start all over. It does eventually manage to swallow it whole, which freaks me out because it's going to be moving around. Ew. But swallows it whole. Got it down. This is a snowy egret, a little bit smaller. They're after smaller prey. They have black beaks and black legs, but they have bright yellow feet. People call them golden slippers. And they wiggle their feet around to stir things up in the water. You can see it's working right at the edge and trying to stir things up.
What are those ducks?
Oh, those are the black-bellied whistling ducks, and then those are common gallinules swimming by.
Common what?
Gallinules? Gallinule? We'll see them too. They forage together, but not cooperatively. So you'll see them. Concentrations, all foraging together. This was at sunset, and they were using the sunlight in the water to highlight the fish. And they'll lower themselves and then dart out when they see something.
Do you have any reddish egret photos?
Of course I do.
I like watching them.
So much different foraging style, much more active than those great egrets. And you can see all those beautiful plumes. They have those plumes year round. Oh, come on. I have to use both things. Okay. Here's the reddish egret. Ask and you shall receive. So reddish egrets are saltwater only birds. They look like they're drunk when they're out there. They run around, they jog, they look like their neck takes off in a different direction than their body. All of those plumes, they'll raise up like a lion's mane. And they really look very erratic when they're out foraging. This is on Fallets Island near the Christmas Bay Paddling Trail. This is off Boudica Road, and this one just gets so excited, it starts like jumping for joy. If you watch, there is a fish moving in front of it in the water. You can just barely see it. And so incredibly active foraging style. Does eventually get a fish.
Yeah.
This species also has a white morph or all white form. They stay that way their entire life. You might think it was a great egret until it starts acting insane. And then you know, no, this is a reddish egret.
What's the size of that guy? Just
Not quite as big as the great egret, just a little bit. So between great and snowy. And again, this one is off Boudica Road, acting crazy.
I saw a white morph and at the refuge that we're going to today.
Yes.
Not that long ago.
Yeah. And you can see it does eventually catch fish with all that going on.
How common are the white morphs?
More common now than they used to be. We see more of them. This is on Quintana on Bryan Beach during a bad winter storm. And this young guy was out there, very nondescript. Could have been a heron, but no, it's acting crazy, reddish egret. So this is a young dark morph reddish. And the behavior gives it away. They're my favorite egret. I'm going to figure this out at some point. There we go. These are cattle egrets. They're our only non-native egret species. They come to our area in breeding season. So during spring and summer, you can see where they get the name. They're originally from Africa, and they would follow things like rhinos and elephants. And they do pick ticks right off the cattle. This is at Brazoria National Wildlife Refuge on the road in. And we had to stop and get video of it actually on account. Yeah, not native.
They'll when I start mowing the pasture, they'll
Yes.
show up.
Yeah.
Swarm the tracks.
Anytime you see them mowing the medians and stuff, they follow along, getting all the food that's stirred up. They're the only ones that have this beautiful yellow plumes in breeding season, which is when they're here. So yellow on top of the head and the breast and the back. But watch this motion. They are after much smaller prey, like dragonflies and insects. So you see them patrolling in the grassy areas looking for food. There's that thermoregulation. See the throat fluttering? And it's just looking for insects or whatever it can find.
So were they introduced here or do they migrate here?
They migrated here.
Okay.
So why are they considered non-native?
Because they were not originally found here. They came over from Africa, but there's a lot of argument about that whole thing. But now they come up from South America. They go to South America in the winter months. This is off Skyline Drive at the Texas City Dike. And so most of the egrets would be foraging in the water, right? But these are foraging in the grass. They're smaller. And watch for that jutting neck motion. Good way to recognize cattle egrets when they walk. So these are in non-breeding plumage. They were about to migrate out. But the fact that they're foraging in the grass and that neck movement, see the little, it's almost like a cat wiggle. Tells you they're cattle egrets. These are wood storks. This is in Matagorda County at the Cornelius Crawfish Farms. And you can also see gray egrets. This is very high vegetation with a lot of water in the habitat. You can see some spoonbills in there as well. So fresh water flooding a rice field. And so they have a very big, unique bill, and they just drag it in the water till they feel the crawfish and then they'll eat it. Very slow, methodical.
What would those called?
Wood storks. And they're in our area in the summer months.
They roost a lot. I'm by the fish farms in Danbury, so
Yes.
it's like a really good
Yeah.
wild bird.
This is near Brazoria National Wildlife Refuge. And these birds, it might look kind of funny for them to be in the trees, but storks nest in the trees. The young ones still have feathers on their head. The adults don't have feathers anymore.
Do they scavenge?
No. And so you can see as they came in, it had a lot of black on the wings, very odd looking birds. But look at the foot shape. They have semi-palmated feet. That means partially webbed. So the ends of the toes are free, but you can see the webbing at the base of the toes that allows them to be in that watery habitat.
Did you initially, I'm just curious about you.
Yeah.
Did you initially start filming like because you're getting really good footage to be able to show
Thank you.
stuff like that? Were you doing that just for you, or are you doing it?
We
in
initially
preparation
were
for
doing
classes?
it just for ourselves.
Mm.
And then the
Because I
more I
like to
started
collect-
teaching classes, I started building.
I like
we
to
have
collect
a-
stuff like that too,
Yeah.
like just for myself. So I was like, it's really good.
These are sandhill cranes. They migrate in these huge lines, and this has sound. We can't hear it, but I usually hear them before I see them. You can see those long head trailing out, and the legs trailing behind and the head in front. Herons usually draw their neck in when they fly. Huge birds.
There's a huge colony in Danbury right now too, in the rice field.
This is in Rocheron. This is off of County Road 192. Those are all sandhill cranes in the background. We estimated there were 2,500 of them there. And winter is when you see them. Now's the time to look for them.
Sound is very unique.
Yes, they
You don't
have a
have any-
wonderful trachea that rolls that sound around in there.
Do the sandhill cranes, they typically stay, I mean, I know they're like flocked together, but they have little family units that they travel in. right?
Yeah, they do. You'll see like small groups together too. This is a great blue heron. This is at the end of the Texas City Dike near the fish cleaning station. Birds are smart, so they're always around those fish cleaning stations. This one found a huge catfish head. It's trying to eat it head first, which it's just the head, but you can see the spine sticking out. And I don't know if it ever managed to get that thing down because I gave up before it did. This is a little blue heron, quite a bit smaller. They're gray blue all over with a purplish sheen on the neck, two-tone bill. Sometimes people confuse them with the reddish egrets because of the coloration, but notice the movement. They are very slow. They place their feet so carefully they don't even stir up the mud in the bottom. So when it starts walking, watch how deliberately it places its feet. So definitely not reddish egret because of the way it's behaving.
Would you find those like in freshwater and saltwater
Yes.
too? Okay.
Mhm. This is in Bolivar, and what I want to call your attention to here, so again, very slow, methodical movement through the area, looking for prey, so foraging visually. But little blue herons do this funny head wag. You can recognize them from a distance because they wag their whole head back and forth. And so when it comes in close here, you'll see that. And that's something you can see from a great distance and know it's a little blue heron. So watch it start moving its head. It's trying to line up its sight. It looks like it's going to poke at it, but it's like, no, psych. Starts all over again.
I've never noticed that before. That's cool.
It's very cool. And so from a distance, that behavior tells you you're looking at a little blue heron. And so this is not Luke. This is actually what this crazy bird was doing. You can see that beautiful purplish sheen on the neck here.
It does look like a loop.
Yeah. Got looped it or something. That's legit what the bird was doing.
It's the base side of Oliver.
Yes, on Frenchtown Road. Like when you get on Bolivar, you turn left, but you can see these in Brazoria National Mall. And it does eventually catch a very tiny fish after all of that. This is a tricolored heron. It's in between the size of the great blue and the little blue. It's the only one of our blue-gray herons that has a white belly, and you can see that both when they're standing and when they're flying. They are like the reddish egret of the heron, very active foraging. This one in the center is a tricolored, and all the rest are little blue here. This is off of Sportsman's Road in Galveston. And so you might confuse them until the tricolored starts acting crazy. So notice it's jogging around, it tints its wings, and the little blues are just plodding along next to it. So you can tell them apart by the behavior as well as the plumage. Very active. And they lower themselves very horizontal over the water and dart out. They're a lot of fun to watch too. This is at the San Luis Pass County Park boat ramp. And we saw this tricolored heron fishing off the side of the dock. And we were like, what the heck? So I had to go see what it was eating. And the tide was in, and it had pushed all of these little tiny fish into that shallow water. And it was just picking them up. You can also see moon jellies come to the surface too. Pretty cool. This is on Highway 36, the Freeport Marsh. Salt cedars are an invasive plant. It's illegal to plant them in Texas. They're very harmful in other areas, very beneficial in our area. They provide cover, nesting areas. The male and female were changing off parental duties. You can see she takes that deadly bill and just very carefully rotates the egg so it incubates on all sides. And then she's going to lower herself very, very gently over that egg. That was right next to the road before they did all that construction down there on Highway 36. This is a green heron. It's our smallest heron, and they skulk along the edges looking for things. They clamber around in the vegetation, but I want you to notice this weird behavior they do. It looks like they're licking their lips. And I know they don't have lips, but they're the only species we've ever seen do that behavior where they're running their tongue along the beak. This one's using this ledge under the water to be able to reach prey in much deeper water. Looks like it's anticipating its meal. They're green on the back. They have that white stripe on the necks that acts as camouflage. Big feet.
And which one is this?
Green heron.
Where do you find these guys? I've never actually seen one.
They're here in the summer months. They're here in breeding season. And this was at Anahuac Refuge, but they're pretty common. But this one out of the water, notice the little tail flicking. A lot of birds do that. Ornithologists think it's a way to let predators know I'm alive and well. I'm not sickly and vulnerable. Don't do it too big. I'll behave. This is a yellow-crowned night heron. They are mostly here in the summer. Night heron's kind of a misnomer. You see them out during the day. They usually skulk around in the vegetation, but this was during breeding season, and this one was showing off for the ladies. Strutting along. You can see its legs have turned red in breeding season. Very proud. They have a very strong, thick bill, and they prefer crustaceans. They will hack at them with that bill to remove the legs and break open the carapace.
Yeah, in our yard.
Do you?
Yeah.
I was gonna say, you see them in the ditches a lot in the
They're in our
summertime.
yard getting the crawdads.
Yes, they love crawdads.
I think they will rob other birds' nests.
They might eat nestlings of like red-winged blackbirds or things like that if they fall. This is along Sportsman Road in Galveston, and we saw this one trying to eat this huge stone crab.
I love how they all seem like they have such Like perseverance when they're trying to eat.
Yes.
big giants.
And again, I don't know if it ever made it into that. This is a clapper rail. So these are the ones that are skulking around in the vegetation. They love fiddler crabs and things like that. They have very narrow bodies laterally that helps them just disappear within the reeds and the grasses. Usually when you get a view of them, they very quickly disappear into the vegetation. They're very common, though, clapper rails.
Is that the one you said that interbred with the
Yes, with the
larger
cute.
one?
This is a mama trying to show the young one how to forage. They get a little too excited. She has to turn around and get onto them. They are so cute. And then this is that American coot. So a lot of times people think when birds are swimming, they're ducks. But if you look at the shape of the bill, it's more like a chicken. They have a white bill that stands out from across the pond. Very dark overall. Their heads are a little bit darker. This one is eating vegetation. It makes me think of Popeye. It's getting algae. And you can see this one's in breeding plumage. It almost looks like it has a little red ladybug on its forehead. And what I want to call your attention to, though, is the foot structure. They do not have webbed feet. They have lobed toes. So each toe has flaps on it that they can fold out like this when they're swimming and paddle. And then when they're walking on vegetation, it folds up. So they will also, they're omnivores, and so they'll dive very deep under as well. We'll probably see some of them today. This is the common gallinule. Similar bird. It's usually in freshwater areas. And you can see it also has that odd bill stripe. Looks like a candy corn bill. And look at the toes on this one. They walk on the vegetation. This is at Brazos Bend State Park with these huge lily pads. And as it's walking, it's exposing prey. You can see the long claws on the toes, and it's going to pull back the edge of the lily pad to look for food underneath. And then can just walk right across all the vegetation. And they're here year round. These are purple gallinules. They're only here during breeding season. And so there's a pair trying to establish a territory, and then all of a sudden there's this interloper that comes running in from the side. Common gallinule. It's thinking these people are, these birds are invading my territory. I've been here all year, and now they're just going to show up and eat my resources. And so I slowed it down. You could see it just come rushing at it. So aggressive display, but no actual physical contact. Purple gallinules are a beautiful shade of purple and blue, and it's going to close in closer here. They have this habit. They have a big white tail, which they're very proud of, and they're constantly flicking it up. You can see that from a great distance. But they also hold their wings, framing that tail. To me, it looks like prayer hands. So you can see that as they're walking around through the vegetation, holding the tail up with the wings down. And they have pale blue on the forehead, but still the candy corn bill. This is at Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge in November. And we saw this bird, very plain. Thought at first it might be a rail, but then we noticed that behavior with the tail and the wings. And we figured out this is a juvenile purple gallinule. Has not yet developed that adult coloration and had not yet migrated out. It's trying to eat that tuber. So this is an example of when they eat the fibrous type of plant materials. And again, the tail and the way it's holding its wings, great way to tell what you're looking at. And then look at these toes on this bird. Crazy feet. So those you're going to look for in the summer months. These are black-necked stilts. Their legs are very long, so they can get in very deep water. Look a lot like flamingos when they walk. They have a long needle-like bill, and so they just pick things off the surface of the water. Occasionally, they'll plunge their head a little deeper for prey that's a little further down, and they do call that plunging. See that there, where its whole head went underwater? This is a bird in the same family group, an American avocet. And again, here it was bathing, using the wave action to bathe, but it gave us a great opportunity to look at it. They have kind of a black and white wings that you can see from a distance, but they have that cool upturned bill, very thin, and they eat aquatic invertebrates. That one was bathing very enthusiastically. Normally, they do what's called scything. So they sweep their head back and forth in the water, and when they find something, they pop it up into the air. They will feed cooperatively. I slowed it down here, and it's still kind of too fast to even see it. But you can see them as they bring prey up, pop it deeper into their mouth. They will form huge swirling masses of birds all foraging together. Blackneck stilts do not do that. This is right at the mouth of the Brazos River, and they were using that wave action coming in. This is at the Bolivar Jetty in February. It was incredibly foggy, but in the winter months, that area hosts thousands and thousands of avocets. So here you can see them all working together, driving prey. You want to go to the Bolivar Jetty during a low tide because that's when the mud flats are exposed. All of the birds in the background are American avocets. They're sleeping. They've got their head turned over their back with their bill tucked under their wing. Can make out that black and white here a little better. But this is what happens when a predator suddenly arrives. In this case, it was a peregrine falcon that came off that tower. All of them came up. This is predator confusion. So trying to be such a mass of birds, safety in numbers. Hopefully, if you're one of thousands, you won't be the one unlucky bird that the peregrine picks off. But you can see them just huge flock of them. And they fly with their legs trailing out. This is a long-billed curlew. This is another bird that comes into our area in the winter months. They have a long down-curved bill, and they use that long neck for leverage. So this one is going along, listening for prey. It's probing down in the ground when it thinks it finds something. And then if it really feels something, it'll just start trying to get it, pull it up out of the ground. Here you can see it does actually pull something up. Well, in a minute. There you go. So it's after like grubs and things. And they will patrol very well-maintained grassy areas, but you also see them on the beach very commonly. Anywhere that the substrate is soft enough, they can probe that bill down it.
I thought that they were primarily like a beach bird.
Beach bird, yeah.
I saw them on 35 the other day.
Yeah.
And I was like,
Oh,
what in here?
this is a similarly colored bird. This is a short-billed dowitcher. And you can see their bill is very straight and sturdy. And they do what's called stitching, like a sewing machine needle. So they poke that bill repeatedly down in the ground. They're feeling for things. And they will forage cooperatively. They'll forage in the grass like these are doing. But they also will forage in water. Short-billed dowitchers are much more common here. We do get long-billed dowitchers as well. They look almost identical. But when they're foraging in water, because they're foraging by feel, they plunge their entire head underwater so they can poke down in the mud at the bottom of that. This is one of my favorites. This is a spotted sandpiper. They are spotted in breeding season, but they have no spots in non-breeding season. But they're the only ones of our little sandpipers that twerk. So they bump their little roots up and down constantly. So if you see a little shorebird, they're edge feeders. So along the edge of the habitat and constantly twerking.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Is that serving the same purpose as what you said?
Yeah.
Tail?
Yeah. I'm alive and well. But one of my favorite birds, and they're very common. Once you start scanning the edges of the habitat, you'll see a lot of these. This is along Sportsman Road, and they're solo foragers, but we saw these two. And so they kind of join together and do a little synchronized twerking. And then they took off.
Parent for that?
It is, yeah. These are American oyster catchers. This is off Frenchtown Road in Bolivar. And oysters can't run, right? They're attached to the substrate, so they don't really catch them. But they look for an open bivalve, and then they use that long bill to reach down in and sever the muscle that holds the shell shut. And then that renders the organism defenseless, and they can pull the meat up from inside. So wangling around, trying to get to that oyster. We have a lot of oysters in our area, freshwater and saltwater. And you can see very sturdy legs. They have beautiful eyes, ringed in orange, and just gobbling up oysters. These are threatened, and so you see a lot of them with bands. The Gulf Coast Bird Observatory has been banding them and studying them for many years now. So if you see one with a leg band, you can report it. There's an online form. You can report it and find out where it came from. The little birds here are sanderlings. They're our most common sandpiper. They're the little wave chasers that run out, chase the wave out, and then run back like they don't want to get their feet wet. I feel like it needs sound effects. Sandpipers as a family group run and run and run. And so they'll pick and feed as they go, but they're keeping their head down as they're foraging. They have a little hunchback. This one found a shrimp that had been stranded when the tide was changing, and it brought prey into it, and it's trying to get control of it. They're little scavengers too, so they will come and eat dead fish that fishermen have left and stuff too. This is a least sandpiper, so smallest of the sandpipers. Very small, and they're so tiny, they look like they crouch. You see how it's lowering its belly? This one is using that wave action that's bringing the prey in and trapping it in that rock, and it doesn't mind when the waves hit it, and it will reach down in those little crevices and pull up things that were left stranded by the water. So this one finds something eventually. I'm not sure what it pulls up, but you can see it pull it out there and eat it. This is one on the beach. And again here, notice the behavior. Sandpipers again, run and run and run. They keep moving. Even as they're foraging, the head's down and they're moving forward. So as a family group, that's a great way to know you're looking at a sandpiper. Plovers. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't want to skip him. This is a sandpiper that's known as a ruddy turnstone. And ruddy just means rusty for that back color, but they come by that name honestly. Notice it's flipping stones over. They'll do that to shells or pieces of driftwood. These were right with all the sanderlings, and notice the sanderlings are just picking at things, but the turnstones are turning those rocks over to look for prey underneath. Beautiful birds, bright orange legs. They crack me up. Now let's talk about plovers. And plovers as a family group run and stop abruptly with their heads up like they're putting on the brakes. It almost looks like they have a little tiny rider pulling their reins because they stop with their head up. These are piping plovers, and they can be recognized by this foot tapping behavior. They go along and tap their little foot. They're trying to stir up polychaete worms under the surface of the sand. So they'll tap their foot, listen for movement, and then go out and get the worms. They're the only one of the plovers that do the foot tapping. Here's that little polychaete worm. It pulled it right up out of the sand, slowed it down here. Little tiny transparent worm that it's able to hear and stir up with that little foot tapping behavior. Killdeer in the plover family. Male and females look the same. They have those two neck bands. But again, they'll run and stop. So they'll run and stop abruptly. They also hiccup. Your book calls it a head bob. To me, it looks like they're hiccuping. And then when they're foraging, they do that odd little stop. So run and stop abruptly. This one is looking for things in the grass. You'll see killdeer in agricultural areas and in parks and grassy areas as well as wet areas. We've seen them on the beach before. But running and stopping. This is a similar looking bird called a Wilson's plover with only one neck band. They are a threatened species. This is that crouch and run behavior. When you see this, if they're agitated, you're very close to the nest. You want to stop moving. So notice they're getting closer and closer to me. I'm not moving. They nest on the ground in a little scrape. This is the male. And so he's coming closer and closer. And notice just how close I am to their nest. I would never have seen these eggs. So very dangerous, can get driven on, walked on. There's the eggs. Do you see them? There's 3 eggs.
Are these the only ones that, the plovers that nest on the ground?
No,
Oh.
most of all of them do, yeah. And so that male is just going to lower itself over the eggs to protect them. And look at how big the eggs are compared to the size of the bird. This is a belted kingfisher. They have a dagger-shaped bill. They're very good. They go hover into the air and then dive down for fish. And this is a female, and she's trying to get control of this fish by whacking it on the high line. Females are more colorful in this species, so she's got a rusty belt as well as that gray belt. But just whacking the heck out of that poor fish, and then she's going to swallow it head first. They have a wonderful shaggy crest, and then you can recognize them on the highlines because they pump their tail upward all the time. Hard usually to get photographs of. Usually they will move one pole down like on the.
I was thinking that was pretty impressive.
This is a great horned owl right near Brazoria National Wildlife Refuge in the winter. They are courting, they're out advertising, so out in the daytime. You can see the little tufts on top of the head, not really horns, but just feather tufts. And you can see they're able to rotate their neck, to look around. It's observing, looking for prey, small mammals. They're kind of the apex predator in their area. So it's just able to sit right out and open and look for things. It's not really threatened by anything. They have bright yellow eyes, beautiful birds, very common along Hoskins Mound Road. If you go there an hour to an hour and a half before sunset and dusk, you'll probably see great horned owls. They're always right along that bayou along Hoskins Mound Road. This is also winter last year, and at nighttime you'll see them perched up on the lines and calling each other. And this one had sound. We can't hear it, but notice it leans forward and it puffs the throat feathers up to produce the sound. And they just say, "Whoo!" So you can see it calling. So it's advertising for a mate or protecting its territory if it already has one. But very common to see them on the high lines at dusk in Brazoria County. This is a barred owl, a little bit smaller, so they stay in the canopy because they can be predated upon by great horned owls. It's being attacked by a mockingbird. So they have big dark eyes, beautiful birds. And this one isn't sure whether it should be more concerned about us or the mockingbird that is attacking it. And you can see this is also before dusk, but we wouldn't have known that bird was there, very quiet, except for the mockingbird. And they say, "Who cooks for you?" This had moved over to my side of the car and was trying to keep an eye on me, looking straight down. Those big dark eyes. This is a short-eared owl. And last year they were everywhere. This is along the Parker Cut Road off the Levee Road in Freeport. And they fly very low over the ground and they do this moth-like fluttering when they see something that might be prey. You can see that owl-shaped face, very flat. And they're diurnal raptors. They forage out during the day. So unusual for an owl, usually in lower light conditions. And they perch on the ground. So coastal prairie areas, they were all over Brazoria National Wildlife Refuge last year.
Is there some rationale for why they were there?
Just more prey that year. Yeah. They've reported this year, but we haven't seen any. So this is same area. It's perched on the ground. Notice the patterning on the feathers is perfect for camouflaging it in that prairie grass. Beautiful yellow eyes that look like they're wearing mascara. This is my favorite owl. Big white face. Just a gorgeous bird.
Which one is that kid?
Short-eared owl. And I had not seen one since I was about 18 when they showed up last year. And my husband, it was a lifer for him or a brand new bird. And then we kept seeing them week after week. They were everywhere last year. And they have been reporting them at Brazoria National Wildlife Refuge in Anahuac this year, but we haven't. This is at Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge, and there's a burrowing owl that overwinters there every year. They tell you it's in the culvert, and so people come, they can find on eBird and it'll lead them right to them, but they're looking in the big culvert in the background, and it's in this little crack in the ground. Small little owl. They normally would be like in prairie dog burrows and burrows created by other animals. This one found a safe habitat and it comes back every winter. You just have to know it's very close to the road and people will be scanning all out in the background and it's right there.
Where did you hear that was?
People were reporting on Facebook that it was there. But you can also find it in eBird and see if it's been reported recently.
Can you set, I use eBird a lot, but can you set like alerts for?
Yes, you can
certain
filter
species?
certain
Oh.
species. Yep, sure can. So this one is coming up a little bit higher. All of the people had left except us. We waited it out. And it finally emerged from the hole, gave us the stink eye. It's like, I know you're there, but we weren't threatening it. We weren't approaching it, just being very still. And so it let us get a wonderful look at it. Pretty little bird. Unusual in our area. This is a turkey vulture. We have both turkey and black vultures here. I want you to start looking at the vultures in the air. Turkey vultures have a long, narrow wing and a long tail. They form a T in the air, T for turkey vulture. And they use that tail as a rudder, and so they tip. They look very wobbly. When I was young, I learned it as tippy tuvu for turkey vulture. Black vultures have a much different shape. This is at San Bernard National Wildlife Refuge just a couple of weeks ago. And both species wait for the warm thermals to rise and then they'll circle. But because black vultures have a broad wing and a short tail, they have to flap occasionally to stay aloft. So as they circle, you'll see them flap, 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 and glide, and then flap, 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 and glide. So you can tell you're looking at black vultures. And they do often flock together. So I'm challenging you to take a look at the vultures. This is an osprey coming to our area in the winter months. They're after fish. They have long, narrow wings that have a bend at the wrist, and so they form a kind of an M shape in the air. They fly over the water and look for fish below. And then they'll make a very dramatic plunge. You can see it swinging its feet forward because it's going to catch the fish with its feet. They have an outer toe that can rotate around. So gets the fish and then they have to carry it head first. So watch it change the direction of the fish in midair.
It's backwards because it just caught it. It's going to drop the fish and reposition it right here and then keep flying. And osprey are pretty easy to photograph if they've got a fish. They're pretty focused. This is our smallest North American falcon. This is an American kestrel. Both male and female have those 2 vertical stripes on the face. They come into our area in the winter months, and they're not much larger than a dove. When they're on a high line, they're bobbing their little heads up and down, and they also pump their tails. So they tend to look very wobbly. So if you see what looks like a dove that's having trouble keeping its balance, take another look at it. This is a female, slightly different plumage, but notice the tail pump, constantly pumping its tail. So even in very poor visibility, you can recognize that behavior and know what you're looking at. So you might think that was a mourning dove, but then it's wagging that tail and bobbing its little head up and down. This is a blackbird murmuration. This was very near us in Manville. And in the winter months, we get huge congregations of blackbirds. And when they're coming down to roost at night, they form these murmurations in the air. It's like a shape-shifting, mesmerizing flock. And you'll see they go down to the ground, come up, thousands and thousands of them. And ornithologists think each individual bird just tracks off the birds directly around it, so they're not running into each other. These were common grackles, but all different blackbird species do this behavior. And this is something you're only going to see in the winter months, because that's when we get the huge concentrations of blackbirds. It's fascinating to watch when you're out with these. These are those cliff swallows. This is at the Burger King at the intersection of 1462 and 288. We were getting burgers, and we saw them coming down to collect mud. It had just rained. We were right near the overpass, and they're coming down. Notice they hold their little wings and tails up so they don't get muddy. And then they were flying over to form those mud nests. So probably 400 trips back and forth to build a mud nest.
I always think that those are barn
swallows do it as
they
well. Mm-hmm.
Which they're so blue, they're easy
Yeah.
to tell. I don't know.
These have
guys.
a buffy forehead and then buffy near the tail.
Is it the cliff swallows have one of them has a forked tail, right?
That's the barn swallow, has the deeply forked tail. So they have a kind of squared off tail, these cliff swallows. And so you can see them gathering that mud. This is off the Trinity River Bridge in the Trinity River Recreation Area. And so notice how tightly packed those nests are. That's why those parasites can invade a whole colony. But each bird knows exactly which nest and which juveniles are in its own. And they come up and they just cling to the side of the bridge like they would a cliff and bring food to the babies. We've actually seen the young ones come out of the nest and be down here, and the adults will push them off to get them to start flying. These are wild turkeys. This is near Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, right at the headquarters. All of these wild turkeys were grazing. They're ground-dwelling birds, and they are looking for insects, and they eat vegetation. They have big, strong feet that they use to scratch things up out of the grass. This one in the background, watch it. It's going to strip the seeds right off of this long strand of grass. There it goes. See that? It just strips it. They are more likely to run than to fly if you scare them. And so these all started taking off once they caught sight of us. And one of them actually does stop and spread that beautiful tail out for us to see. Very cool. This is a common nighthawk. They're not a hawk, but they hawk in the air for insects. So on the wing, they have a very teeny tiny beak and a huge mouth. You can see them in the summer months here. They come in during breeding season. They're the ones that fly overhead if you're like at a sporting event and they're near the lights or like at parking lots of shopping centers. You see them, looks like they're sleeping during the day. They perch. Those are the wings in the background, very long wings. This one is preening and you can kind of see that wing shape. But what I want you to notice here, an insect flies by and it just kind of has a reflexive action and opens its mouth. And look at the size of the mouth on this bird. These are monk parakeets. This is a non-native species that has become naturalized. This is on the Texas City Dike. There was a ton of sunflower seeds. There's also some grackles in there. But they just go and eat sunflower seeds in the wild. So you can see it's picking out the special flower there. Gonna eat it. They're very common at the Texas City Dike. Very loud when you hear them. And just breaking apart the seeds and eating them.
Texas City Dike, is that down by Freeport?
Oh, it's on Galveston.
On the way to Galveston.
Cause don't they have those? Is that?
We have these in a lot of areas. There's some in Pearl.
Okay, cause
Yeah.
you said they're the monk parrot?
Monk parakeets. People call them Quaker parrots too. That's
Okay,
the
I've
pet
seen them
store
in
name.
Freeport.
Yeah,
A bunch in Freeport.
yeah, a lot in Freeport as well. This is a marsh wren. Wrens as a family group hold their little tails straight up. And this one, usually they're very difficult to see, but this one had just migrated in. This is at Brazoria National Wildlife Refuge at the Discovery Center Boardwalk that we'll be at this afternoon. Usually we hear them but don't see them. And it is looking for little tiny insects. It's picking them off the surface. And it was so hungry, it wasn't paying any attention to us at all. We were quite close to it. And then you'll see how it just disappears into the reeds, which is usually where they are. You usually hear them and try in vain to actually get to see them because they do just disappear completely once they get in the reeds.
Are they as tolerant of humans as the
No,
No.
no. But just gone once it's in the reeds. And again, that holding the tail straight up, the wren family as a family group holds the tail up. Ah, this is a hooded warbler. They're one of the first warblers to appear in the spring. They feed on the ground. And so they have big white patches in the tail. You can see it flashes that tail. White in the animal kingdom is a sign of danger. So they flash it to try to get the insects to move. They're very, very tame. If you work at the Quintana Neotropical Bird Sanctuary during spring fling, they'll come right up to your feet. The males have that hood and the females don't have that, but the behavior will tell you what you're looking at.
Did the females have the bib portion
No.
of it?
Mm-mm.
No.
This is a yellow warbler. This is at Campeche Cove in Galveston. And again, these are those salt cedars, very beneficial cover and food for birds here. They hold our dunes in. And they forage within the canopy and flutter around as they're looking for insects. So again, looking for insects, but staying within the canopy rather than going down to the ground and then fluttering constantly. This is an indigo bunting. They pass through in the spring briefly. Males are a gorgeous shade of sapphire blue, but they twitch their tails sideways constantly. That beak tells you they're a seed eater, very strong conical shaped beak. And then this is our last slide. This is one that everybody looks for here, painted bunting. And they are a lot harder to see. The indigo buntings, you'll see flocks of them. The painted buntings, you'll probably just see a pair together. They are actually here year round. They nest here in the right habitat. But you can see they feed on seeds. And so it's feeding very low to the ground. This is also at Quintana Neotropical Bird Sanctuary. And watch it just strip the seeds right off of the grass and eat it. Beautiful birds that you mostly see in the spring whenever they're during migration, but they are here year round, so we find them in the right habitat. That's it, you guys. That was the end of it. So I hope that made you a little more interested in birds. They're fascinating. You can learn. I'm still learning. I've been watching them for 50 years. I still learn things every day. So please, while you're out and about, if you see a bird, stop and watch it for a little while and try to look at the behavior and figure out what it's eating or what it's doing. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
In the wild, do like in animal rescue, the birds will take their mouths when we feed them and scrape.
Oh, wipe it off.
Yeah, wipe it off. Is that just because of what we're feeding them,
Probably,
or is?
but I do
they
see it in
that
the wild. When we were down in McAllen, there's green parakeets down there that are actually parrots, but they were wiping their bill. We have video of them wiping their bill on the high line trying to get them. So if they're eating, stuck on there though. Any other questions?
Do you have pet birds?
I do not. I one time had a pair of cockatiels. My first husband's mother had it, and when we were there visiting in Oklahoma, she said, "Take this bird with you. It's here by itself all day." And I feel bad for it. And so we had it. We got a huge cage, and we got a second one. But then when we moved, we weren't able to take them. And I feel bad about having them, but they're fun. I mean, it would whistle jingle bells at me, and it hated men. So when my husband came up to the cage, it would hiss at him. But when I came up to the cage, it would hang upside down and flutter its wings and make kissy noises. I do have books, and I also teach classes. You can get advanced training credit if you're interested in birds. I just started a beginning birding Zoom series on Monday nights. They're all recorded. So the first class was last Monday, and I have the recording of it. If you're interested in that, let me know, and I'll get you a link for that. And then on Thursday nights, I have a Hot on the Trail workshop where we show videos of what we saw during the week, and the participants work together to describe it and identify it and try to find it in the field guides. And the only rule there is if you know what it is right away, don't shout it out. But they're a very silly group of people, and they love when new people come in. And that was just ongoing.
Do you have some field guides you recommend for the area?
I always recommend North American field guides because in Texas, you see a lot of Eastern and Western and winter. And there are field guides just for Texas, but they don't have all the birds that might show up.
I really like the National Geographic.
I was going to say, I carry around National Geographic. My favorite is the Golden Guide, but it's out of print.
The sparrows in that one are like
Amazing. They have a spread.
yes.
Street presidency. That's the one I carry. I can't recommend it though because it's out of print. There's birds that aren't in there. They've changed the names of them. The range maps are worthless because,
Right.
it was published. The first one I had was published the year I was born in 1966. And then the one I carry around now was published the year I graduated high school, 1983. And the last one was published 2004. So in 20 years, everything's changed, but it's my favorite. Yeah. My mom uses Kaufman Guide to Birds, and then Sibley Guide is very good. It's very heavy. I keep it in my car.
Sibley has a life list journal too.
Yep.
It's really neat if you like.
If you want to keep track. And my books, I have activity books for kids that teach them about birding and conservation and native plants and observation. I have a journal that they can record their signs. I have a field journal for adults as well that has all of the tips that I teach in the beginning and then where you can keep track. And then a year ago, I published a book called Bird Detectives, Science Sleuths and Their Feathered Friends with the Smithsonian. And that tells about the work done at the Smithsonian to identify birds from bird strikes when they fly into planes and cause accidents like that one that had to go into the Hudson River. So I worked with the lead ornithologist at the Smithsonian to tell about her life's work.
Oh,
cool.
Yeah, that one's cool. All right.